In the interest of time, we might move to our questions from Twitter, and we're going to do quick hits on these because I think all of them open up really big cans of worms. Might start with you, John. We had a question from Moonwalker. What does Taiwan do, and does the West's response to Ukraine affect China's next steps in Taiwan?
Yeah, I mean, this is the question that's basically been asked about China from the moment that Russia attacked Ukraine back in February. It's a huge question. I think so. The context here is that Xi Jinping has just re-established himself for another term minimum, massively consolidated his power within Chinese Communist Party structure. He is essentially untouchable now, or at least very close to that. And what he says will go. So that's the first bit of context. The second bit of context is that Taiwan, the reunification of Taiwan, which the Chinese Communist Party considers a runaway province, that is a non-negotiable for the Communist Party. It always has been, but under Xi Jinping, it's like the thing. He wants to bring it back to China as like the completion of his legacy. He's very into sort of these destiny. He sees himself as a man of destiny, and Taiwan would complete it. So that's the state of play, is that Taiwan is super important. Xi Jinping wants it, and Xi Jinping can do whatever he wants within China. Obviously, the US is involved insofar as they don't want that to happen. I think there was some interesting kind of rumors / reports floating around, which I think the genesis of was actually US naval intelligence, like officially, but just saying that there's this window that the Chinese have decided on between now and 2027 to retake Taiwan, because they estimate that that's when they'll be able to take Taiwan. I think there was a good point made by someone where it's like, it's not about China defeating America at war, it's about relative strength in that region. And I think this report from the US thinks that China thinks that they will be ahead of the US in Taiwan until 2027. So you have this window of opportunity for China to retake Taiwan. You have China wanting to retake Taiwan. The question then becomes when, or largely when, and what does the US do? I personally don't think Ukraine makes the situation worse. I think Ukraine, if anything, tells China that they can't make a mistake. Military options are literally the absolute last thing they want to do. So I think in a way it makes the chances of a Taiwan war a little less likely. I have a lot of friends who think the opposite. I think I have a lot of friends who say that the US and the West is so focused on Europe still. It's like a mentality thing that they will just not be able to effectively prepare for the Chinese and the Taiwan situation. But I think largely the short answer is that the Ukraine doesn't change much about China's approach to Taiwan other than maybe make it more conservative. The issue is still huge. It's the biggest unknown in world geopolitics right now.
Yeah. I think that's probably fair. I think it's also fair to say that, you can't guess what the lessons China itself has learnt from Ukrainian resistance, the performance of the Russian army, and Western sanctions is. There's one way you could look at it where you go, oh no, it's a really bad idea to try your largely untested armed forces against determined resistance. It ends really badly, and maybe our army's not as good as our generals are telling us it is. Oh, and look, the West rallied on sanctions. But then there's another way where you look at it and you go, well, Europe didn't cut gas. So on things that are critically important to the European economy, even with a crisis in their own backyard, they didn't immediately pull the cord. B, the Chinese army is not the Russian army, and we won't make the same mistakes. And, maybe they think Taiwan is not Ukraine. So like all of these kind of, you just don't know what the lessons even they're learning, let alone the rest of us are.
Yeah,
that's one
I
to
completely
watch.
agree.
Might do one more question. I might take my hand at this one. We got a question from Hul on Twitter asking, will the UN and WTO exist in 20 years, and what will inform their future shape, status, and influence? And Rahul particularly was interested in views from outside the US, EU, and China. Very, very briefly, yes, I do think they will exist, not just because it is virtually impossible to kill an IGO. After World War III, there will still somehow be committee meetings in New York, Geneva, and Nairobi, because these things never die. But more seriously, it is precisely the states outside those three global emerging superpowers where organizations like the UN and WTO offer a lot in terms of ability to influence the global agenda and the ability to form coalitions to redress the imbalance of power that you get when you sit down at a negotiating table across from the United States, EU, or China. In the WTO, the least developed country group, which is the group of members who are the poorest economies in the world that are part of the WTO, basically caucus together and try to speak with one voice, precisely because they know that the individual voice of Rwanda may not have as much influence, but if it is the collective voice of the world's poor, that has to be taken seriously. And the WTO, through its consensus mechanism, the UN, through its mechanisms where you have to vote and where every vote counts, kind of give those members a greater ability to influence global affairs than they would have in its absence.
Right, yeah.
So I think they are going to be champions of it to an extent, while still having immense frustrations with both organizations. That's forever. I would also say that it's important to remember that, especially on the UN, there is the Security Council and the General Assembly, which, their performance you can have different views on. The UN is an absolutely vast organization that encompasses everything from the UNFCCC to UNESCO to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. It is this vast thing that does everything from refugee resettlement all the way through to very, very wonky technical standards at UNCFACT about like the terminology for blockchain customs. And so it's this vast thing that even if the General Council and Security Council completely loses relevance, the UN as a global IGO, right, at the working level will continue to be relevant, especially to those countries outside the US, EU, and China, where they do a lot of their work.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I'm no expert on that stuff. I would just add two things, and one is that, I think a lot of people say that it's China and Russia and perhaps some of the other countries that are trying to challenge that liberal world order or the Bretton Woods architecture or whatever you want to call this multilateral architecture of the world. I think the reality is that none of those countries or the people who lead those countries want global anarchy and instability. They want to change the balance of power within these organizations so that they can control them / influence them and this US influence over them. But China definitely wants global architecture to run the world. It just wants to be in charge, or at least be very, very influential within it. They don't want to burn it down.
Yeah. And I think outside of another Trump presidency, that is where the US is at as well, despite all of their frustrations with individual elements. That's certainly where the EU is at. The EU is never happier than when it is in a complex bureaucracy with multi-level decision making. Like God, they'd build 5 more if they could. So the big players are also probably not going to smash the system, which means these things will probably limp on. And I look forward to all of the clips of, hey, this you, or this aged well, when like the whole thing is
blows up in 6 months.
Yeah, in 6 months when Geneva no longer hosts anything.
Do you know what? If the UN and WTO and all that comes crashing down within 6 months, I will take the tweets because we've got bigger problems.
Yeah, at that point. Well, maybe you do. I rely a lot on these guys for work, so my problems will be very acute. But that brings us to the end of our show. Only 10 minutes overtime and not the 8 hours we suspected. That is a win. We can take that home. Thank you so much, everybody who tuned in and put up with this slightly experimental approach. Hopefully we were not so obnoxious as to turn you off us forever.